Terranigma is a SNES action RPG released in 1996. The game was developed by RPG developer Quintet and published by Enix in Japan, and localized by Nintendo in other territories. Terranigma's release is an oddity, having never been published in North America, not even years later on the Wii or Wii U's Virtual Console. There's never been any official reason for the lack of a release in North American territories, though it is safe to assume that the game's use of religious elements in the plot, combined with Enix of America's closing at the time, were core reasons. A massive shame nonetheless, because Terranigma is a game that easily stands with Chrono Trigger and Final Fantasy VI as the best Japanese RPGs on the platform. Terranigma starts out simple enough. You play as Ark, a mischievous young male whose overly curious nature causes him to be wrapped up in the resurrection of the world. The premise might sound cliche, and well, that's because it is cliche. However, Terranigma does a plethora of things that set it apart from other similar games. The big thing is Terranigma's setting. The game takes place in a fantastical realization of the real world, and not your average fantasy medieval world. It is a breath of fresh air, especially compared to similar games released in the time frame. Despite being based on Earth, Terranigma's world is immensely interesting. Throughout my journey, I constantly wanted to find out how the game would utilize the real-world locations. The plot itself is great as well, but paced rather slowly, especially in the beginning parts of the game. You'll go from dungeon to dungeon, reviving continents and other elements of the world, with only small bits and pieces of dialogue throughout. But after a certain point in the game, it starts to ramp up by quite a bit, with a huge amount of twists and turns, along with many memorable moments. Terranigma's plot also deals with fairly unique subject matters, especially for a Japanese RPG released over 20 years ago. Elements of both religion and politics are dealt with and talked about in interesting ways, more so if you delve into the game's optional content. The weakest part of Terranigma's story is probably the characters and the English translation. Throughout your journey, you'll meet plenty of unique characters, but outside of a couple of the side characters, they feel wholly underdeveloped, making certain moments throughout the game lack the impact that they would otherwise have. Next, the translation. To put it bluntly, Terranigma's English translation is bad. Dialogue is often stilted, awkward, and chock full of both spelling and grammatical errors. In a lot of cases, the English script feels like a rough draft that was never looked over. There's also various examples of area names having to be condensed to fit within a text limit, like New Zealand simply being called NZ, or Evergreen being called Eve Green. In the end, despite both the poor translation and the underutilized characters, I still found myself enjoying the game's writing and story. It's just a shame that it could have been so much better. Gameplay is sadly where Terranigma falters the most. The game is an action RPG with rather straightforward gameplay. Ark will move around in a top-down perspective, defeating enemies, exploring both dungeons, towns, and solving puzzles, and for the most part, each of these elements ends up working well together. Ark controls and feels great to play as, and its combat moveset in particular is satisfying to use, even if it doesn't really develop throughout the game. The main problem comes from the game's RPG elements. Like you might expect, you defeat enemies to gain experience points to then level up. However, once you get to the middle to late game, the balance becomes utterly out of whack. Enemies will take 1 damage per hit at one level, and then the next level they will take up to 20 or 30 damage per hit, despite there being only a difference of a few points in strength between those two levels. This leads to situations, especially with some of the later game bosses, where if you aren't at the appropriate level, the amount of damage you're going to do is pitiful. Fighting a boss with 600 plus HP while you can only do 1 or 2 damage per attack is not fun, it is a slog. While the combat balance is a bit hit or miss, the level design throughout Terranigma is mostly spectacular. Ark's ability to jump across gaps, swim, crawl under certain objects, and climb up mountains leads to uniquely designed dungeons with a fair amount of platforming and puzzle solving that you might not expect from a JRPG. Outside of the odd, not very fun stealth section, each new dungeon was a treat to explore and finish, and I always found myself wanting to see the next one. One of my personal favorite parts of Terranigma was the ability to develop certain towns throughout the game. By doing various side quests in each one of the major towns, you will increase their economic growth, causing them to develop and grow. These aren't minor changes either, they basically become brand new cities for you to explore. Even if most of the side quests are just fetch quests, I found it to be extremely satisfying to watch each place grow. It is just a shame that the system isn't very well explained within the game itself, making it likely for the average player to miss out on the entire mechanic. Graphically, Terranigma is a beautiful game. The game makes the most of the SNES hardware, with Mode 7 and other special effects used frequently to enhance the visuals. The sprite work is great throughout, with my only real complaint being I wish there was a few more unique designs for the enemies, as there is a decent amount of recolored enemies. Musically, Terranigma has an absolutely phenomenal soundtrack. Pretty much every track is a joy to listen to, and each song fits the area or scene it is used in perfectly. I genuinely do not think there is a weak song in the entire soundtrack, which I can't say for many games. In the end, Terranigma is not a perfect game. It is balanced in odd ways, and the poor English translation is a bummer. But Terranigma is a remarkable game. The unique story, fantastic music, graphics, and fun level design all combine to make Terranigma one of the most memorable, unforgettable experiences from that era, and it is a game that easily stands with the giants in the genre.